My name is Robbie Bickerton, and I'm the current director of teaching at the Bayes Centre at the University of Edinburgh. And I am going to chair the event for the next hour. And I think we all know in general that AI and generative AI is somewhat of a hot topic issue at the moment, kind of throughout all aspects of our society. That means there's a lot of information, some of it positive, some of it negative. People can't agree on whether generative AI is a good thing or bad thing, or maybe some gray area in between. And in particular, for education, we're kind of really seeking to understand at all levels what knowing something means when a student can simply generate an answer at the click of a button. Of course, I leave it to your own judgment as to how often those answers are correct, but that's a different matter. But I think what we have undeniably seen over the past couple of years is that more and more people are turning to the use of generative AI in their studies to help with them, to help with their learning and even to help with their teaching. So it's a question that is not really going to go away. So hopefully, in order to help us think about how we can navigate such a complex technology, I'm very happy to pass over to our panel of experts who will hopefully introduce themselves and help us think about how we can answer the questions in this area. So, Sean, would you like to begin?
Hi, everybody. My name's Sean Bain. I'm a professor of digital education. I'm based in the Edinburgh. Oh, actually, I think you might be unmuted. So I'm based in the Centre for Research in Digital Education, which I'm director of the research centre there. I'm also, I've got a university level role as assistant principal for Education Futures, and part of that is about being the person who tries to keep the student generative AI guidelines up to date. Actually, I think you're unmuted. I can hear some background. Anyway, that's me. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. And yeah, sorry if I think I also heard a microphone there. So anyone who's not on the panel, if you just wouldn't mind muting yourselves just for the moment. Thank you very much. Jasmine.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jasmine Conwell. I'm a project officer on the Data Education in Schools team. We were initially funded to bring data literacy into schools across the Southeast Scotland region. We've now expanded that to include critical AI literacy, and we've also now expanded to the whole of Scotland, and we've been working with partners abroad as well. So in my role, I'm mainly out in schools working with teachers, or teachers are coming to us at the university, and we work with learners as well, developing curricular resources.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jasmine. Jadida.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jadida Ajala, and I am a first-year computer science student at Edinburgh University. In my last year of school, I was studying subjects like computer science, religion and philosophy, and maths for advanced higher. But during my last year of school in 2025, I was also selected as a student co-researcher for a computing education study with Edinburgh Uni, where we were examining the potential integration of AI tools into high school and how students felt about Gen AI, what they use the tools for, and kind of how they navigate that in school. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here and dive into these interesting questions.
Yeah, thank you, Jadida, and thank you to all of the panel for agreeing to be here. I think what's a really nice thing for today is that between the three of you, we really cover quite a wide range of educational ages. We were saying this just before we started, that some expertise lies in higher education and also expertise at school level as well. So just before we start, I just want to run through quickly how this is going to work for today. So we have some questions for the panel that we've prepared, and we will spend the first half of our session going through those. But for the second half, we'd really like to hear questions from you guys in the audience. So if you have a question, please post it in the chat. Please don't ask it out loud, just because it helps us manage the questions that we have and certainly manage our time, because I dare say we could talk about generative AI for more than 1 hour, right? And Kian is going to monitor those questions and then send them to me when we open up for discussion. I hope that seems reasonable to everyone. So, as the panel have said, really, we all know that in the past year or so, in particular, interest in generative AI in education has kind of rapidly expanded, right? AI isn't really a new concept, but widespread access, public access to generative AI is relatively recent. And the technology is advancing at an extremely quick rate. And I think that has kind of left educators in particular trying to keep up with the speed of technological advancement in institutions that don't necessarily move as quickly as the technology does. And indeed, you can kind of see this if you look at the UK government statement around generative AI, who view AI as a growth sector and one of the main ways that the UK could potentially achieve their goal of growing our economy. And I think it's fair to say that training around AI and education around the use of generative AI is kind of key to this plan for the government. Papers highlight the danger of the UK falling behind other AI economies such as the US or China. And as such, there's been a lot spent and a lot of really exciting and interesting activity going on in the realms of AI and education. And there's certainly, I think, an interest in the potential that it has, but also some concerns about what it might mean in particular for things like assessment integrity. So, with this in mind, let me move on to our first prepared question for this afternoon. So, I would like to ask the panel, what would you say are the main changes generative AI is causing in how we view education and learning in general? I don't know, Sean, would you like to start just because you're closest on the screen?
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to. Um, I think in terms of how it's changing, I think there's maybe when you just spoke about your introductory remarks there, Robbie, about this perception that universities don't travel as fast as tech and have trouble adapting. I think there was a fundamental problem there, which lies in a lack of understanding what the core mission of universities is, which is, it can be multiple things, and skills development and working towards student employability is really important. But we also do other things like teach students how to think critically, or teach students how to ask hard questions of what they're told. So I think that there are some. I think to some degree, generative AI is fundamentally at odds with the universities, with higher education's core missions so far. So what I see when I look at the impact is a really interesting trajectory, almost of mood in higher education. So from 2023, when there was, when ChatGPT kind of dropped and there was massive interest and engagement with it, very quickly became concern, primarily around assessment integrity. And then also we started then to look at routes to adoption actually quite quickly. But then by the time we got to 2024, I think there was a lot more kind of critical questioning of the impact of generative AI and whether it was actually good for universities, good for higher education. So we started to see lots of work on the kind of empirical evidence around the impact of generative AI on learning, for example, and perhaps within academia, a bit more growing opposition to it as well. And now I think that we're in 2025, 2026, where there was we're kind of resigned to it, aren't we? We're kind of looking at ways to mitigate it, but we're also starting, I think, to look at really creative ways of using it on our own terms. And I think that's really important. But I'll let my colleagues comment further on that. I just think it's a complicated history and a complicated politics and a complicated conversation between what tech does and what higher education is for.
Thank you, Sean. That's really interesting. And I think it's a non-controversial statement to say it is a complicated question, right? Jasmine, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I think in Scotland in particular, we're lucky with our school curriculum, our 3 to 18 school curriculum, in that we're quite different from England in that we've been trying to move away from a very content knowledge-based curriculum to more of a skills-based curriculum. And there's been a movement sort of pushing more in that direction. So now there's a meta skills framework that is trying to couch everything in terms of creative problem solving skills and critical thinking skills. We're currently in a curriculum improvement cycle at the moment where all the different curricular areas are being revised at the moment. And so I think this is a really crucial time for thinking about how are we going to change that. And there was a lot of hype, as Sean was saying, over the last few years, sort of, what is this new technology? What's going to happen? Is this going to be revolutionary? And I think now we've kind of got past that a little bit. And we're now at the stage where we're starting to realize even more so how important skills like critical thinking are. So I think in that way, we're starting to go in a more positive direction where people are not talking so much about how do we incorporate generative AI into schools at all levels, but more, do we need to? And if so, at what stages? And what's the best way of doing that? And what are the skills we really want all learners to go into the world having? And so I think it's prompted those conversations, and it's positive in that respect.
Thanks, Jasmine. Jedidah, do you have anything that you wish to add?
Just to agree with what everyone else is saying in terms of what you were saying about kind of conversations and talks about AI in the past year have really kind of ramped up. I was at one similar talk yesterday, and we were talking about AI used in kind of industry and corporate companies by software engineers and the likes. And the speaker was asked an interesting question that he was talking about him using Claude Code and things in his work to kind of get things done faster and more efficiently. And he was asked, well, if you're basically saying that Claude Code can do it for you, us as computer science students, why are we really studying? And I think that kind of view towards Gen AI in education is almost to the extreme. That kind of feeling of apathy of like, well, if the model can do it for me, what am I really learning for 4 years? I would say I'm not at that side, but I'm in kind of the middle way of I believe that the fundamentals are everything, and that in education and higher education, those are still core concepts that are held to high value of if you don't know a coding language, you won't be able to assess the output from an AI model. So it's kind of those fundamental thinking skills of I can problem solve, I can work through an output logically and see its faults and its pros that I think we're coming to understand more as a really integral part of education, given this kind of this other being of AI challenging the way that we're looking at education now. So, yeah.
So I wonder whether we could unpick a little bit of what you guys have just said there, right? Because all of you have said that you've seen a little bit of a perception shift with attributes to Gen AI over the past few years. So let me ask maybe the obvious question: has that shifted closer towards consensus, do you think, about its validity of use or about how people are feeling about it in general? Jasmine, do you have any thoughts, or Sean?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. I think, like with everything, there are people at sort of extremes of the spectrum, and there are some people who are very enthusiastic about adopting AI into schools in whatever way possible. And I think that if we don't do that, we'll be left behind, and young people will be left behind. And then there are people that think it has no place in schools at all. But I think, luckily, most people have more of a nuanced view and are sort of coming more to the middle. And I think a lot of interesting conversations are being had. So that at least the consensus is around these conversations need to be had now. And it's kind of being prioritized. There's been so much going on this year. We've sort of, our group has kind of helped bring different institutes together in Scotland. So we've tried to create spaces where Qualification Scotland, which is the exam board, is able to have conversations with the head teachers board and the Children's Parliament, which is bringing children's voices into this, and with Education Scotland and the Scottish Government. So I think the consensus is these conversations need to be had and continue to be had, and people need to work together across all these different levels to come up with more joined up thinking, because at the moment it's just been a little bit of, well, some people are going way ahead and adopting it. There's other local authorities like the City of Edinburgh that's completely blocked AI applications in schools. So I'm hoping in the next year there's going to be a little bit more consensus being built about a national policy going forward.
Thank you, Jen. Sean, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, Robbie, you said, is there consensus? No, there definitely is. There definitely isn't consensus. I think there's more resignation and acceptance, perhaps, that this technology is with us now, and we have to work out what to do with it. But if you look across this university, the picture across disciplines is very different. Some disciplines are really quite resistant for good reason, and then primarily in the humanities, others are much more kind of on board with it. So I think it's dangerous to think that there's consensus. I mean, certainly in terms of research. So my research is within, I suppose you'd call it critical digital education, and there are a lot of critical scholars who are extremely worried about the influence of big tech over schools infrastructure, for example, whether you have a government big tech partnerships rolling out ed tech within schools and also within universities. Ed tech is a massive growth industry, and we know that AI is a kind of a massive growth industry, and people are out there to make profit from it. And if you can get your AI into schools, you're going to be in a great position to start to make money. So I think that we have to be careful to keep that kind of critical perspective on what's happening. None of this is politically neutral. But at the same time, we are kind of really creative thinkers in universities, aren't we? Almost by definition. So we are thinking creatively about what we can do with this and how we might use it well, and what our students might find acceptable and interesting and what they might not. So yeah, I think it's more of a mixed picture than you might have been suggesting there, Robbie.
Is somewhat of a loaded question. So something else that all of you mentioned in your answers, I think, was the need to develop critical thinking and problem solving skills. So I guess a question I have is, how can we balance the use of generative AI in education with the need to develop these skills for students? Jedidah, I don't know whether you have any thoughts on this.
Yes, I most certainly do. Part of the research that I did last year was some field work going into my school at the time and running focus groups and kind of seeing students kind of S3 to S6, so that's 15 and upwards, kind of hearing from them what are their concerns, what are their perspectives and kind of opinions on using AI tools. And what was a resounding kind of feedback was that learners were voicing concern over the long-term dependency on AI. And if we think about it, was this time last year that they were saying this, and they were talking about, well, we can get to a point where there's dilution of personal style when we're thinking about creative domains such as music and the arts, and things that if that style is diluted, then you kind of question what the point in using AI for that is, like it defeats the purpose. But in relation to critical thinking, we're definitely getting to a stage where students themselves are questioning whether we're undergoing critical atrophy and cognitive kind of offloading to these tools. So it's a very prominent question that not just educators are thinking about, but students ourselves. I definitely think about it a lot in terms of when is using AI, a tool, or when is it crossing over to, okay, it's doing 70% of the task for me. And I think just making that a very much central question to whatever you're doing as a student is something that should be a widespread advice, and advice that students are calling for better guidelines and clarity on how to responsibly and ethically use AI, whether we're talking like environmental or like kind of the personal ethics of I actually do want to complete this task on my own, but I also know and recognize I need assistance with this. But yeah, that's what has been kind of the conversations going on.
Sean, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, because I think Jedi just made a really important point there, and I think what we've seen in recent years now we're starting to see interesting and reliable empirical evidence coming through around the impact of generative AI on learning. So there was a lot of really sketchy stuff in the early years, but now there are some really good studies which show kind of in summary that AI used in education, it does support productivity, but that learner overdependence has really negative effects on higher order skills like criticality and creativity, retention, and so on. So if it would be useful, Robbie, I can put some links into the chat. There are a few really interesting papers that have come out in the last year or two that show cognitive offloading is real, and there is a significant negative correlation between frequent AI use and critical thinking abilities, and that students, if they use AI as a crutch, that does actually result in them performing worse when that crutch is taken away. So I think, if people are interested in looking at some of the research coming through from learning sciences, I'll stick a few suggestions in the chat.
Please do, Sean. That would be great. And I think Ken would remind me that we will share some extra links and extra information after this session to all participants as well. Jasmine, I think you mentioned these issues over skills and skills and Gen AI, I guess. Is there anything you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, our hope in tackling this in schools is that by the time young people get to university level, they have that criticality, they have that ability to think about, do I want to be using these tools, or how do I want to be using them? When do I want to be using them? And our goal is in the curriculum framework that we've been putting together. Our goal is that before learners have opportunities to use these sorts of tools, they first understand how they work and what are the ethical issues around them. And that sort of education we're hoping can be coming in even towards the end of primary school. Learners, at some point they're going to be exposed to these. A lot of young people now get phones when they start secondary school, sometimes even before this. So we're hoping before all that happens, just the same way as there's health and well-being and sex education, that learners get before they're ever introduced to these things in their lives. We're hoping the same thing happens with critical AI literacy, and that's incorporated into primary students' education, not using the tools, but just understanding what these are and how they work, what are the sorts of biases that might be built into them, so that they fully understand that before they're then going off and deciding how or if to use them.
That's really interesting. Thank you. So, I mean, that leads on to my next question, which is, how can Gen AI be used, do you think, in an innovative way to enhance student learning and to enhance education? I guess maybe I can start by appealing to you here, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are quite a lot of promises around the potential of generative AI to enhance learning. I think often those promises are a bit problematic. For example, we regularly see this claim that generative AI can personalize learning to match individual student needs. For example, that's a really, really common one that we're hearing. And I've been working in digital education now for about 20 years, and honestly, this promise that tech can personalize learning is like it's a promise of the ages, and it's often built on a kind of fundamental sort of misrecognition of teacher professionalism within the tech industry. We've never really seen good personalization technologies in education. Well, certainly higher education. Jasmine can speak to schools. So I think we need to be really careful of these big promises and actually think really critically as educators about what they mean for us. I mean, for me, it's more interesting to think about the question of how we can scaffold access to AI to make it actively useful in class. So I think one of the papers that I just put in the chat shows that if students use GenAI in a normal way, it reduces their ability to learn. But when that AI is scaffolded and safeguarded via tutors and guardrails and so on, it does actively improve student learning. And at the moment, I've got a project running called AI for Teaching Innovation, which is developing apps with academic teams within the university that kind of do exactly that, that scaffold students' access to GenAI in a way which is discipline specific and relevant to teaching need. So I'll share the link to that as well in the chat.
If I could jump in, just because I think I agree with everything that Sean is saying, and I think that's even more so in schools. There's been a lot of this promise and this hype that these tools are going to revolutionize school education. And this is coming from the companies that are trying to make money off this. But these tools were not designed for children and young people, and they were not designed with education in mind. So I think there's a really big gap there of what's being promised and what is actually available, and what would be needed in schools. And there hasn't been that working together with teachers and young people of what do you actually need. And what Sean was saying about this promise of technology personalising learning, very much in schools, the biggest thing that teachers and young people want is a sort of better student-teacher ratio, so that it's the teachers themselves that can personalise the experience of learners. And it's that personal human touch of a human that understands you and can guide you and really understand what you need as a learner, the teacher who has the time and space to get to know each of the students in her class or his class. And I think, there's a big gap between what tech companies have designed with other things in mind, perhaps, and what might be designed if we actually listen to what young people and teachers in schools really needed. And I'm hopeful that there will be more people exploring that space, and that's where researchers in universities can help and do research in this space and help to work with people to co-design technologies that actually are useful for education.
That's really interesting. Jadida, what are your views on this?
I would say that when teachers and educators know how to wield these AI tools, the students do in turn benefit, because it's not a situation of like the blind leading the blind and the person higher up not really understanding kind of the concept. But definitely what came through in the research was that students really are desperately calling for their own AI literacy, not just for themselves, but also for their teachers, in terms of I can put more faith and kind of trust in a teacher who is open to experimentation with AI, but also kind of knows the back end too. And they are almost confident in what they're doing as well. And I think off of what Jasmine was saying, that kind of personal touch, I actually pitched an idea of this AI shoulder buddy at a Scottish Parliament talk in late 2023. And this idea of like when you're in primary school, and you're stuck on, maybe your times table, maybe your 7 times 5, my teacher would always say, think about it really hard yourself. And then if you're still stuck, turn to your left and ask your shoulder partner, the guy sitting next to you. And then if you both can't work it out, then ask the teacher. And now I'm understanding that, to be honest, in a class of 30 raucous, rowdy kids, all trying to get through their maths, and there's one teacher, I can see the kind of claims of AI efficiency and getting more done in less time and less effort. I can see kind of the benefit to that. I can see like why that's an appealing kind of thought. But at the end of the day, if this shoulder partner was replaced by a chatbot, and what Jasmine said, that weren't really tailored with children and young people in mind, Um, if you got your shoulder partner to do all of your times tables for you when it came to a test, whether it's a primary 3-1 or a P4-1, you wouldn't know what to do yourself. So when it comes to using these tools effectively and innovatively in education, I feel that if it's used and narrowed the scope of these are the tasks that students can and should is a bit prescriptive, but can use AI for, and some that, okay, you should just really do on your own because of X and Y benefits. I think that's where we kind of should be going in terms of it's not just a catch-all technology, it's got its caveats, it's got its pitfalls, and recognizing that and building that into guidelines is where we should be going, in my opinion.
Thanks, Judida. I think that's a really interesting summary, and it leads me on to, I guess we've spoken a bit about some of the potential positives of tech and some of the things that people are worried about. So I wonder if I could just zone in on something that I think comes up a lot when people express concerns about the use of Gen AI in education. That is, how can we ensure that the use of generative AI is inclusive and accessible to all of our students? I guess let me ask Jasmine, kick us off on that.
Yeah, that's a tough one, and I think maybe it comes back to who's designing the technology. We would hope that that technology that ultimately does get brought into schools is designed with a diverse range of teachers and young people's voices there. I think we're already seeing, sorry, there's people bursting in on this room. No, I've got it booked. Sorry about that. People trying to come in and use the room. Where was I? Yeah, so I think we've already seen lots of cases of these tools being designed by quite a limited segment of society. We've seen examples of how these biases are already built into the output. The sort of language that these tools are trained on is then being reproduced, and that's language and that's ideas that are from a very small subset of everything that's out there, namely a sort of global north or Western set of data that they're trained on.
Absolutely. Thank you. Sian, do you have any experience in this as well?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think it's really difficult because essentially it's not really possible, certainly for us as individuals, to kind of ensure that there's absolute justice in terms of people's ability to access and use generative AI in education, because the issues underpinning that are they're systemic and they're structural and they're infrastructural. So I think it is a problem for the institution as a whole. And I think on an institutional level, we have done some things. Like I think the Edinburgh language model approach is pretty good as an institutional thing that we can do. We can set up a language model or a cluster of language models, as does, and give all students equal access to those language models without having to pay subscriptions and so on, and with full privacy protections around them as well. So I think if we could develop more projects like Elm and kind of work with that kind of principle and that ethos, I think that's probably the best thing we can do at the moment as an institution or as a cluster of individuals.
Yeah, that's interesting, Sian. Certainly in my experience, I found that access to Elm to be quite a very useful way of addressing some of these concerns. So just in the interest of time, I would like to move on to the final question that I have for the panel. And ultimately, I wondered, how do you guys see generative AI transforming education over the next 5 to 10 years? And I'm going to ask Jadida first, if that's all right.
Beautiful. I think especially in my degree of computer science, I think in the coming years, we're looking at what I said before about narrowing the scope and really specific tasks and operations that Gen AI can be used for and should be used for, and almost that more focus on the soft skills that you need in society and you need in the workplace, and the concept of teamwork and collaboration, all of these buzzwords that we hear all the time. But we're really thinking actually having a generation of people sitting in front of their screen prompting AI models is maybe not the best for our social skills. But yeah, definitely a more emphasis on that. We live as humans in community, and we work better together. And using technology to kind of further those efforts has its place and has its time. But figuring out where that is what's coming in the years to come.
Thanks, Jadida. Jasmine, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I love what Jadida said, and I think I'm similarly hopeful. Just sort of seeing the direction that things seem to be going in, and how willing people that are involved in school education and education policy are to have these conversations. I think that it looks like education is, in Scotland at least, is moving in a more positive direction to value things like that, to value critical thinking and problem solving. And I'm really hopeful that we'll end up with a generation of learners that feel empowered to go out and disrupt these spaces and design tech that works for everybody, not just for a few.
Thank you, Jasmine. Sean, would you like to wrap us up on this question?
Yeah, thanks, Robbie. I think it's a really good question, and I really liked the other Jedida's and Jasmine's answers. I think from a higher education perspective in particular, I think part of this is about remembering our value as universities. You know, universities literally train the engineers who build generative AI. You know, we don't have to be always in responsive mode. We don't always have to, I don't know, have this kind of narrative of, oh, universities need to catch up with tech. I think we need to understand that we have agency here. We can define how we want this technology to work for us within higher education. But I think given that, we also need to kind of work quite hard, I think, now to define our value. So this is, you know, we've got a world in which higher education is no longer primarily about knowledge transmission, right? So we need to stop trying to kind of pin down the exact kind of location of the line between human and non-human understanding, and instead we have to maybe try to ask, you know, what comes next now that that line is becoming extremely blurred. I think the nature of knowledge is shifting, and that we need to kind of work out how, as a university, we can allow our social mission to evolve in response to that. So focusing on what's fundamentally critically important, you know, ensuring we have a society which values people's ability to interrogate truths, for example, and to work with complexity, to create and to challenge. So I think there are some big challenges for universities, but I think we're really well placed to address them.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks to all of the panel. I thought that was a nice place to end that first half of this session. As I said, I will move to taking some questions that people have posted in the chat. So thank you to all of you in the audience who have asked questions. Please just bear with me as I scroll to the ones that Kin has kindly sent me. So the first question we have for the panel from the audience is, what do you think about the government's January AI in education requirements, i.e. requirements not to anthropomorphize, imply emotions, personhood, agency, or identity, avoid I statements such as I think, avoid using names, avatars, give an impression of personhood, identity, or agency? Are any of you familiar with this?
I'm familiar with the ideas that are being queried there in the question, because I think it's really important, isn't it? That it's basically about how do we understand what AI is, and how do we talk to students and also to children about what AI is, and the importance of not. I think that AI generally is full of quite toxic, or technology generally is full of quite toxic metaphors that actually hide the kind of reality. So, for example, cloud computing has been really critiqued as a kind of actively working to make us believe that there's no environmental impact of tech, for example. And I think artificial intelligence is one of those quite toxic metaphors. you know, we have to tell our students or remind ourselves that AI is not intelligent in the way that humans are intelligent. Yet the language works against us in doing that a lot of the time. So I think it's a really good question and a really good set of ideas to be thinking.
100%. I know I always have to you have to remind myself, certainly if you're entering things into a chatbot, you're not speaking to an intelligence, you're speaking to an algorithm, and it's quite difficult to remember that at all times. Jasmine, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with what Sean said, and I wonder if this is a place where how we design tech going forward, if there's a way of designing it so that it isn't so built into the design to anthropomorphize the tool. So that currently the way things like ChatGPT, it's really designed to make you feel like you're speaking to a person, and maybe that's not so helpful.
Jadida, any final thoughts on that?
Just to add to what Jasmine was saying, in terms of in the back end, a lot of these large language models are really just prediction models. What they're saying is almost like they're making it up on the go. They're like, okay, what's the best word that fits after the last word that I've just outputted? So, yeah, I do kind of agree with the perception and view that is put forth in like these big tech companies. I mean, I don't think you can say they don't know what they're doing. They're making tech for, their own business reasons. But I think kind of getting people in there and saying that actually considering your audience and considering the people that are using it, let's turn some of this algorithmic thinking into things that can benefit the user in the long run. And maybe not just in keeping on the models for as long as possible, but kind of, using it for the task that you've came there to do and not answering the follow-up questions that you get at the bottom of every prompt. Because that's about a bottle of water that you're using and environmental impact on the other side of the world. So yeah, I agree with all that was said.
Absolutely. Thank you. So the next question from the audience I see is, do you think that higher education actors face significantly different AI impacts to school actors? What are the key similarities and differences between, I guess, the effect of Gen AI in schools and at higher education? I guess, Jasmine, maybe I can start at schools and then we can move to Sean to discuss higher ed.
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, particularly when we think of very young children who haven't really developed the conceptual skills and knowledge about thinking critically. That's something that's being built from a very young age. Like a 4 or 5 year old is not going to have the concepts in place to be able to understand really everything about how these tools work and how to think critically about them. They're still learning about other people's minds, and can people tell lies, and what does that mean, and when someone tells them a fact, how do they there isn't so much of that understanding of is this true. They're just kind of accepting what's being told, so it's a really sensitive period. So I think we have to be really, really careful when we're thinking about particularly those young learners. Hopefully by the time learners are getting to university, they have enough of those basic skills in place to make some decisions for themselves about it. But at very young ages, I think we have to be really careful about what we're allowing learners to be exposed to before they even have the cognitive skills in place to be able to critically evaluate them.
So, Sean, at higher ed, is that experience that you echo, or are things different?
Well, things are definitely different. I mean, I think, yeah, Jasmine, listening to you talk, it makes my hair stand on end. Like the idea that you've got 5 year olds using generative AI extensively. I mean, that's just a big no, isn't it? But by the time people get to university, I mean, it doesn't always feel like it in universities, but we do have a lot more agency over how we use these things than I think possibly a lot of schools have. So as individual academics, basically, those here who are teaching, we have almost complete autonomy as to whether we allow our students to use AI or not. And if we do allow them to use it, then how they can use it within our courses, for example. So we do have a lot of autonomy. We can kind of design use of generative AI according to our discipline and our subject area and the topic that we're teaching. And I think that's really positive. And I think we have to sort of embrace that agency and kind of use it to do what we think is the right thing. So yeah, I think if it's more complex and perhaps not quite as empowering within the school's context as it is within higher education.
And Jedidah, I guess you're a person who's made that transition from school to university more recently than any of us. Have you noticed these differences? What's been your experience?
Well, personally, having been in like the second end of secondary school, kind of when ChatGPT and we had more access, public access to AI models and all of this, it started off very much as like, wow, this is a new shiny thing. And then it's kind of like that fear and confusion that we've been talking about earlier in terms of, oh, what what is this black box of I put something in English and it brings me like a whole essay structure out, for example. But I think, yeah, using that in secondary school is almost, you've got lower level tasks, I would say. So for example, if I was using it to help with like my higher English assignment, I wouldn't be at the point of being like, ChatGPT, write this all for me. And I think that was very much a false preconception back then, or like when I was in school, teachers would be like, okay, it's banned. Otherwise, students are just gonna all output their essays using ChatGPT, Gemini. And there was very much that kind of tone of um, no use at all is the way to go. But I think transitioning into uni, there is that realization of actually it's more independent learning. And if you don't understand, say, the way that your lecturer is teaching something, then you'll go online and you'll either watch a YouTube video, you Google it, or now you can chat it or chat GPT it. And I feel that you're using it for more subtasks rather than your whole task. Because you know that if I really don't understand, in my example, this whole coding task that I have, then it's not going to help me for the next one. Whereas when you're doing tasks in school, it's kind of like you submit one project and then you move on to something completely different, maybe in a different subject. So it's kind of that difference in task and that difference in what the ask is, and that kind of tailors where it's being used. But I think what Shannon and Jasmine were saying and kind of where we're going, well, hopefully going, and kind of pinpointing where this should be used, that is what students are calling for after kind of a couple of years of almost scrambling along with the teachers of like, oh, what do I use it for? Am I going to get in trouble for using it? Am I going to be looked down on and things like that? So yeah, that's my perspective.
Thanks, Jedidah. I think we certainly have time for at least one more question. So, next question I can see. You were talking about using AI as a clutch and then students struggling when this clutch is removed, for example, in tests or exams. But will it actually be removed in real life? Students go out in the job market more and more companies will use AI to do more and more routine tasks. So do you think we should maybe reimagine how we test them? Maybe less on knowledge and more on co-working with these tools to understand something they do not know? Or should we keep tests as they are and maybe suggest different ways that they should use AI, for example, in their assignments? And actually, let me begin by asking Jedidah, because I'm interested from a student's perspective here. What do you think?
I would say the conversation we're having here is almost kind of a cycle of, when the internet boom happened and when Google came out, there was kind of the naysayers saying, "Oh, I don't want my children on Google. They can just go and Google anything, and that's not what we're wanting for them." It's kind of similar to that tone of yes, we do know that young people, not young people, young children, so yeah, your 5-year-olds, your primary school kids shouldn't be using these Gen AI tools, at least in the way that they were made to be used for. Um, but when it comes to kind of that crutch, it's almost realizing that if you're using AI as your shoulder buddy, when it does come to a traditional test time, you really won't know what you're doing. You'll be kind of lost. And I think students definitely do realize that. But kind of matching that realization to navigating, okay, I know it's a tool and it's waiting to be used, but pinpointing where to is kind of that gray area of some people use it more, some people use it less. And what is the outcome? Is one getting better test results or is one not? And that interesting follow-up question of kind of reassessing how we assess students is very much what's been on our minds because we're like, well, if I'm gonna have to go back to the dark ages and write on pen and paper because assessors are scared of students using Gen AI, it kind of feels almost unfair. It feels like we're going backwards instead of forwards, especially when you're going out into the workplace and you know professionals are using it a lot more than what is allowed at an institutional level. But I think, yeah, navigating that and kind of feeling out where and when will inform the type of test that we'll be taking in the future. I just don't think that we're there yet in changing the way that we've taken tests for yonks and yonks. But yeah.
Thanks, Jedi. That's really interesting. I'm slightly conscious of time, but Jasmine, do you have any brief thoughts on whether this is a discussion happening at school level?
Um, I would say it's it's maybe more something that would come up at the university level. So maybe Sean could speak to this, but I would maybe question the assumption that it is going to transform workplaces across the board. I think it really depends on the field, and whether the tools are used and how they're used, and it remains to be seen. But there is some indication already that um, the adoption in businesses is not really happening in the way that some of these companies have hoped. Um, so I think it's up to places like universities to kind of shape how things might be used in specific fields and educate learners accordingly.
Thanks, Jasmine. And Sean, my apologies. I'll give you 3 sentences to be profound.
Yeah. I think this is the kind of conversation that we always have in higher education around the tension between what's our purpose? Is it to train students for employability, or is it to teach them as people to grow? And I think that's that's always the tension here. It's one that we're used to balancing as academics, and we just need to continue doing that within our own discipline areas and our subject areas according to what's most appropriate. So I could go on for ages on that one, Robbie, but I won't.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think that's all the questions that we'll have time to discuss live today, but I'm aware that we had more that we couldn't get to. So the ones we couldn't get to, we will try and respond in the follow-up emails, and we'll send something and some thoughts from the panel on those things. So I guess just to end with a very quick few thoughts wrapping up, I think I go back to what Sean said at the start. This is clearly a complicated topic, and I'm sure that we could actually spend hours and hours talking about the various facets of generative AI in education. But hopefully, there've been a few things that we've discussed here today that at least help spark some thoughts on the topic. Ultimately, it seems to me in kind of this new age we live in of generative AI, it seems that education and what we do as educators matters more than ever, right? Because we're trying to teach our students how to think and how to engage with things critically, not just what to say, which is often what they might get from a generative AI. It seems that there's nuance to a lot of these discussions, and it seems like it's certainly possible for this to be a great technology when used in appropriate frameworks with appropriate support for students. But we shouldn't be all aware, we shouldn't jump both feet first into that without critically engaging with what we all, I think, all agree are worries that we have with it. So I hope that that is a reasonable summary of the things that we've spoken about today. It just remains for me to thank our panel once again. It is a real privilege to have you guys here for an hour. Your expertise is greatly appreciated. I would also like to thank the Bayes events team for help setting this up. And thank you all for coming. Please keep an eye out to the follow-up that we will send round. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much for hosting, Robbie.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.